So, welcome to another video here at Back to Classics, and today we're going to discuss something special from a different but equally famous Italian motorcycle manufacturer, this Laverda 750 SFC. Laverda, as you also sometimes hear, especially from English speakers, but it's actually Laverda, as I've heard. So, I hope our Italian friends can approve of that. I will try to refer to this motorcycle as a Laverda in this video. So let's start with some historical context of the SFC and Laverda as a motorcycle brand, because there are many parallels actually between the history of Ducati and that of Laverda. Both companies were not founded as motorcycle manufacturers at all. In fact, Laverda was founded in 1873 by Pietro Laverda and sold farm equipment. And actually that company still exists to this very day, being now part of a US conglomerate called AGCO, much like Ducati Energia, which is still existing to this very day as well. And both these companies can trace its roots back way before Ducati and Laverda were actually making motorcycles. Now, much like Ducati with their Cucciolo, and we made a video about that bike as well, which we will link up here for more historical background. But Francesco Laverda, he was the grandson of the company's founder. He foresaw an upcoming demand for cheap transportation in war-torn Italy right after the Second World War. And that's why Moto Laverda was founded in 1949 as a spin-off from the farm business they already had. And it operated from the family-owned business premises in Briganza and Vicenza province in northern Italy. In these difficult post-war years in Italy, they needed affordable and simple transportation. Small motorcycles became as essential as bread and wine, actually. And that is why Laverda at the beginning, they made small, humble motorcycles in 75, 100 and 200 cc. But built with the same no-nonsense engineering they applied to their agricultural business. Form over function, you might argue, rugged, even overbuilt. And these bikes, they carried over the DNA from the combine harvesters, durability first and style distant second. And the result was that the motorcycles Laverda was making, they were heavy but exceptionally reliable. As with many Italian makers of motorized vehicles, the temptation to go racing is irresistible in the end. And that is also seen with the entry of Laverda into racing in the early 1950s. They took their small machines and entered them into the MotoGiro d'Italia, and they were quite successful, especially in 1954, when Laverda humiliated Ducati at first in the 100cc class. Though Ducati had their revenge in 1955 and 56 with the Taglioni designed Grand Sport Mariana, of which we, by the way, also made a video, which we'll link up right here for even more historical context about those years of MotoGiro d'Italia racing back in the early 1950s. Now, throughout the 1950s and most of the 1960s, Laverda's range was made up of small to mid-size capacity motorcycles, mostly ranging from 49cc mopeds to 75, 100cc and even a 200cc single engine. They were practical, durable and in tune with what the average Italian rider could afford at the time. So by the late 1960s, the times they were a-changing, and not much else in the motorcycle industry at the time, with the Japanese bikes coming in from Honda, Yamaha, Suzuki, Kawasaki, all big bikes, fast, quite reliable, so they were very, very popular, and that meant that the way a motorcycle was used was changing. It was becoming more recreational rather than a cheap form of transport that it was in the 1950s and 60s. Francesco Laverda's son, it was Massimo, who also went into the business. He went on a trip to the US and there he could see the writing on the wall. Laverda, they needed to push forward with new developments, and he came back with the famous words, "We need a bigger bike." So that bold move was undertaken, and in 1966 Massimo, together with the engineer Luciano Zen, they began work on a completely new prototype, a 650cc parallel twin that was about to change Laverda's course in the history. Now the layout and design, they were sort of influenced by the Honda CB77 Superhawk, a bike that had impressed Massimo for its reliability and engineering. And here you can see that we often accuse the Japanese of stealing European designs, but in this case it was quite the opposite, where Laverda blatantly copied a design made by Japanese Honda at the time. But I guess it's better to steal something good than to make something bad yourself. And it was a huge step forward for Laverda as a motorcycle manufacturer. In fact, it was presented in Earl's Court, London, where the press was amazed by that quality and style and engineering coming from such a small Italian motorcycle manufacturer as Laverda was at the time. And you also have to bear in mind that it took Ducati 5 more years to come up with a large capacity motorcycle of their own, the 1972 750 GT. So Ducati was beaten by this well in advance by Laverda. Now the prototype's extra strong design, its robust frame and over-engineered cycle parts reflected a little bit of the company's agricultural DNA, so to speak. Much more aimed at reliability than lightness and sportiness. However, it also proved the basis and hinted at racing potential, especially in the realm of endurance. And well, the design quickly was stretched to 744cc, and that became the 750 GT in 1968. A bike that was very much known for its reliability already back in the day. And Laverda, they proved their point with the tests and endurance runs with the bike running from Italy to North Africa and back to make sure that this bike was as reliable as it could be. And that caused a bike this to be quite successful in, especially in the Italian market in those early years. Now, by the early 1970s, endurance racing was booming, especially with events like the Bol d'Or in France, the 24 Hours of Os right here in the Netherlands, and of course the 24 Hours of Barcelona at Montjuic. It became battlegrounds for manufacturers, and that is where Laverda, they wanted in. And of course they had the bike to do that. Now, in some ways, the history of Laverda, they already reflected being successful in endurance racing. Of course, they had some experience in the MotoGiro d'Italia in the early 1950s, but especially their approach that came from the agricultural side, of course, much aimed at reliability and rugged engineering. Yes, they were heavy, but they could also be abused. They were very reliable units, and that was in fact the perfect mindset for endurance competition. And in 1969, Laverda entered the 750S into endurance racing officially. So around 1969, 1970 and 71, Laverda, they were quickly developing the platform into a all-out endurance racer. Now, first the 750 SF, the Sport Freni, that became the 750 SFC, the Sport Freni Competizione. Of course, the Super Brakes Competition, as it literally translates, a bike aimed at competition only, a stripped down and tuned version with the purpose of winning endurance events. And in May 1971, Laverda produced a tiny run of just 23 pre-series machines known as the 5000 batch, which is referring to the frame number sequence that was used for these 23 bikes, all within the 5000 realm of frame numbers. These were not showroom bikes. They were built by the factory's racing department and specifically for competition to be tested in the toughest environments of long-distance endurance racing. Although based on the 750 SF road bike, the 5000 batch SFCs were heavily re-engineered, and the engines now had higher compression pistons, larger valves, gas flow cylinder head and revised camshaft for stronger performance, and inside stronger bearings and high capacity oil pump were fitted to handle with the sustained loads of 24-hour racing. And fuel and air were mixed by twin 36mm Amel concentric carburetors. The chassis was also upgraded, the frame tubing was thicker, the geometry was revised and the suspension beefed up to cope with the high-speed pounding over many hours. Bodywork was down to the essentials, a hand-formed aluminium fuel tank and fiberglass fairing,
and seat unit to keep the weight in check gave this bike a purposeful look as a high-strung racer. Now these SFCs were purpose-built by the competition department with reliability given equal weights to outright speed. And that philosophy paid off. In their first year, these bikes won multiple endurance race victories, including Zeltweg, 24 Hours of Barcelona, it's Montjuic, the 24 Hours of Os, Vallelunga, Bol d'Or, Imola, Modena, the list goes on and on. It was a very, very successful campaign by Laverda with the early SFCs. Now these SFCs, competition bikes, they were maybe not the lightest or the most nimble machines in the paddock at the time. But it had a combination, a unique combination, so to speak, of speed and rugged construction, which means that these bikes were running longer and were better equipped for long distance endurance racing as many of its rivals. And that is the way Laverda was so successful. It wasn't just about speed alone, it was very much about reliability. As the saying goes, in order to finish first, you first have to finish. And that is what Laverda proved with the SFC platform, as it was so successful in these years. Now the 8000 batch was technically the second series of Laverda 750 SFCs, but really it was the first serious production run consisting of approximately 75 machines. They were built right at the end of 1971, going into 1972. And although these still were crudely constructed racing machines, the 8000 batch featured many significant improvements over the earlier 5000 batch. Actually, the lessons learned in that 1971 racing season all saw their way into the 8000 batch model. Notably, the fuel tank now was made of lightweight fiberglass rather than aluminium, and the exhaust system was redesigned with longer downpipes to provide more ground clearance on the racetrack. The engine too was upgraded with a close ratio gearbox. And the 8000 series also received Laverda's second series of drum brakes. Now the third series of SFCs was known as the 11000 batch, of which production began in March 72. So actually right after the 8000 series was finished. It included around 55 motorcycles that are known today. Exact numbers are unclear, as not all bikes within these ranges are actually SFCs, nor are all SFCs within these ranges. So it makes identifying a true SFC a little difficult. But apart from that, visually the 11000 batch bikes, they were a little bit more refined compared to its predecessors in the form of the 5000 and 8000 series. So what was changed, first the headlight was changed. It was now flush in the fairing instead of sticking out. And as well, most notable is the exhaust system that was now underneath the engine, again to increase ground clearance. There were two mufflers available, a pea shooter and also a more road use oriented chrome exhaust that was available as well. And other details improved the revised swing arm, the newly designed center stand to accommodate for that new exhaust system, and also some further changes to the fairing and the seat unit. This 11000 batch represented the pinnacle of the drum brake SFC's development, and it resulted in a sleek, stylish and instantly recognizable classic. However, on the track, competition had caught up and the victories became rarer for 1972 and 73. Actually, in 73, no production racers were offered to the public. Only a handful specially built factory racers were built in that year. But the next evolution came with the 16000 batch that was available in spring of 1974. And that marked a major leap forward, featuring a unique low and lightweight frame, redesigned from the earlier models, as well as the swing arm, now a 38mm Seriani front fork, and of course the triple Brembo brake discs that were fitted to these models. And that was what made the 16000 batch, made the drum brakes of the earlier bikes a little bit outdated. It was like I said, a major leap forward with this new batch in 74. Now many of these brake disc FSCs were raced in production in Formula 750 events, and but the bike also earned fame as the Tangerine Torpedo, as it was called, a brilliant cafe racer, both then and now, of course. A total of 110 units were constructed within this 16,000 batch. Now, in that same year, 1974, the 17,000 batch was constructed as well, aimed at the US and Canada markets. A total of 122 units were built, sharing much of the specification with the 16,000 batch, but featuring a little different handlebars taken from the 1000cc triple, but also instruments from Nippon Denso rather than the single rev counter from Smiths, a different CEV taillight, a mirror, all to comply with US regulations at the time. So sales in North America was modest, leaving the bikes unsold until 1977, 78. You could still pick them up new in showrooms in the US at the time. And that brings us to this particular 750 SFC from the 18,000 batch known as the Electronica. A total of 160 of these were made, and it was fitted with a Bosch electronic ignition system, hence the name Electronica. Distinguished with a special primary cover that was developed for this model in order to fit that ignition system. And like the 16,000 series, it's sported lower frame and 3 Brembo brake discs that you can see here as well. Numerous other upgrades made its way. Most technically advanced SFC, you could argue, the last of the line, but also the most advanced and fastest, with also the engine upgrades, which included the crankshaft to be revised again for the ignition system. But most work was actually done to the cylinder head. That had a redesign of the combustion chamber, had different valve angles, and that also included new ASSO pistons with higher compression and new cylinder barrels to be developed as well. So the engine work that was done on this final SFC was quite extensive, and therefore it is the most powerful of all SFCs that were made. The chassis components for this 18,000 batch, they were largely the same as on the earlier 16,000 batch, with only a few changes. However, this particular bike is from the very last series within the 18,000 batch, and that included a total of 33 bikes that got these aluminium casted Flam wheels rather than the Burani wire wheels that were fitted to all other SFCs prior to this one. So here you have the last of the line production SFC with the aluminium casted wheels that were much more in fashion back in the 1970s as the old-fashioned Burani wire wheels that we very much like today again. But that's how fashion goes, I presume. Anyway, production of the Laverda 750 SFC ended with this series, the final version that you see here. And they switched their focus towards the larger 1000cc triples and other models like the 500cc twin as well, but limited resources and increased competition, changing market demands, meant that the company never replicated the SFC's success. It was quite unique for that matter. Laverda as a company went into decline in the 1980s. Another parallel with the Ducati story, because they were not having the best time as well back in those days. But where Ducati was able to turn it around in the 1990s, after the Cachiva takeover, Laverda never recovered from its former to its former glory, so to speak. The company eventually was taken over by Aprilia and is now a sort of a shelved brand in the Piaggio group. That is what's left of Laverda to this very day. Now today, as we look back on a total of 535 SFCs that were made across the different badges, ranging from 1971 till 1976. So it's far from a mass market product, and more a symbol of an era, of course. And that is an era in which Italian manufacturers like Laverda, they could still challenge the giants in motorcycle industry and be successful, at least for a few years, in their respective way, with endurance racing in this instance. So that is why this effort of Laverda back in the day should be applauded now, as it is quite remarkable how they achieved that success in the early 1970s with a bike like this, solely aimed at endurance racing as this bike was. So that is why more than 50 years on, the Laverda 750 SFC, they still command a ton of respect and a touch of awe as well. So enough of the history. Let's take this bike out for a ride in lovely summer weather here. And I'm very, very keen to see how this bike holds up to this very day on the road where it belongs.
So, let's take the Laverda 750 SFC for a ride. Should we include one in the collection? I must admit, it's quite a while since I last rode a Laverda, especially an SFC. These opportunities don't come by every day, so I'm quite keen to see how this bike is holding up. Yeah, what immediately strikes you when you're getting on board one of these is that sitting position. My God, this is uncomfortable. Of course, it's all part of being a high-strung racing motorcycle, as this is, but even compared to the Ducati 750, it is really cramped. But I guess that's all part of the fun. You should not complain about that and just enjoy the ride, because it is one sporty ride indeed. Now this bike of course was developed for the racetrack, and that's what you notice when you're underway with one of these, because this chassis, when you flick it into a corner, it is really confident, beautiful balanced, again just like that Ducati. Perhaps it's a little harder to be underway with if you compare the two. Sitting position, also the vibration, and you notice that the center of gravity is a little higher than on the Ducati, which means that you have to manhandle it a little bit more into the corners. But like I said, once you're in a corner, this chassis gives you all the confidence you need to accelerate out of it. Yeah, forgive me for constantly comparing this bike to the 750 Ducati, but of course part of that is me being a Ducati fanboy, which is not a secret. But also, if you compare this with its rivals, and you imagine yourself back in the 1970s with the money and the desire for a high-strung Italian sport motorcycle, what could you buy? There were three really on the list. First the MV Agusta 750S, later the America. But when you wanted to really use it as a sporting motorcycle, that bike obviously with its stupid drive shaft, it's clear that that bike was never meant to be used as a racing bike. It doesn't say anything about the beautiful racing bikes that MV Agusta was producing at the time. But these were not available for the public. So for the more hardcore enthusiasts, there were really two options left. And obviously that was the Ducati 750, first the Sport, later the Super Sport, and then you had this one. So I don't think I'm much off by comparing these two bikes. So the engine compared to the Ducati is a little bit heavier with the starter motor of course, and that brings the center of gravity a little higher, which makes for a little bit more work you have to do into the corners. Not that that's any problem on the Laverda, because it, like I said, the chassis is beautifully balanced with high quality components such as the Siriani front fork and the Brembo brakes, so nothing to complain there. Yeah, this is really fun. So I guess in a way the Ducati is the bike that is easier to live with on a daily basis. Of course you don't have the vibration coming from the parallel twin, a lower center of gravity, a little lighter, much of the same quality components. But then again, this 750 Laverda is more hardcore. With the sitting position, you really feel like a race driver on the racetrack with this one, more than on a 750 Ducati even. Talking about the vibrations, yes, there are some coming through, which is to be expected from a 750 parallel twin with the engine mounted directly to the frame, and that adds again being a little bit less comfortable and quite hardcore, this bike. But I must admit, I was expecting it to be much harsher, and that is certainly not the case in this instance. It's very important for these Laverda engines to have a well-balanced crankshaft that this one obviously has. So to sum it all up, this is a bike that is really capable in many ways, but it's not for everybody. This is something, if you want to enjoy it, you need to put aside the comfort that you find on many other bikes and just take it as it is, namely something really special you can use on a racetrack, perhaps even better than on the open public road. But if you then step aside that, stop complaining and just enjoy the ride, it is a beautiful bike and something really special indeed to be on the way with one of these.
Now that was real fun getting one of these SFCs on the road. Now this bike is for sale. We'll put a link up in the description where you can find this bike being presented on our website. Lots of pictures and description for this one of the final batches, one of the last 33 ever made, with matching numbers, etc. So it's very nice original SFC from 1976. So I hope you have enjoyed this video as much as I did making it. If you do, please like and subscribe to our channel. That really helps us a lot. We thank you very much for watching. Toodaloo-dokie. See you next time.